Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Learn at Lunchtime. We're so glad you could join us today. I'm Sherry Trimble. I'm your kind of technical director, kind of guiding everybody through all of this process. And now I would like to turn it over to my fellow museum educator, Beth Erickson.
Thank you, Sherry. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Beth Erickson, museum educator at the State Museum of Pennsylvania, and this is Adventures in Nature Lab. With us today is Ryan Reed, Natural Resources Program Specialist. He has worked in the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources Bureau of Forestry for about 4 years in the communications section. Prior to working with DCNR, Mr. Reed taught biology and environmental science for 11 years. An avid sportsman, he is the editor and lead writer for the Bureau's weekly column, Forest Fridays. And many of you may be familiar with his weekly fall foliage forecasts during autumn as well. Hello, Ryan. Thank you for talking with us today.
Hi, thank you. My pleasure.
So, Ryan, tell us a little bit about what you do.
Sure. So you mentioned I work in the communications section, and I use a variety of methods and media to inform the public of our mission in conserving 2.2 million acres of state forest lands. And as you might imagine, a related objective is conservation of clean water, which is essentially our focus today, as you all see.
So today's topic is vernal ponds or vernal pools. So these unique habitats are needed for certain plants and animals in Pennsylvania. Tell us why they are important.
Well, sure. Let me go ahead and start sharing. I'll get that pulled up here.
Yeah, you put together some great slides. Perfect time of year for this topic too.
Yeah, it is. And so if you've been out and about, maybe hiking in some low-lying areas, maybe you've noticed some areas that are inundated with water. And those at this time of the year, we call these vernal ponds. And that's the name of our presentation today. So let me go ahead and advance to the next slide. And before we really get into it, we need to understand what a vernal pond is. And that really comes with defining the term vernal. So vernal refers to spring, and vernal ponds are springtime ponds. These ponds are temporary. Some people might say they're ephemeral, which means that they don't last forever. Oftentimes they will dry up just after a few months. Vernal ponds result from meltwater from snow, which we had plenty of this year. And they also result from early spring rains. So you may wonder, well, what's so special about these temporary ponds? Well, it turns out that they are very important habitat for a wide variety of organisms throughout our forested lands in Pennsylvania. Vernal ponds provide habitat for forest animals that require water for a part of their life cycle. Some of you may recall learning about amphibians in maybe your biology class in middle school or high school or even before. And amphibious means that they have both a land stage and an aquatic stage. And these vernal ponds are extremely important for many of those critters that we classify as amphibious. Pictured here is a red spotted newt, which actually isn't a salamander, it's a newt. It's one smaller subdivision that's very closely related to salamanders. This is a very common forest dwelling organism in Pennsylvania, and they require vernal ponds.
So they'll spend part of their life in the pond and part of their life on the land?
That's correct. So the stage that you saw there is the newt form, but there's another stage that they go through, which is the land form, and that's called the red eft. And that's actually the one you're most likely to see them occupying, is the red eft form. And there are many other organisms that require vernal ponds, but a closely related relative is the spotted salamander, shown here, and one of the most common salamanders in Pennsylvania. This one happens to be in a family of salamanders called the mole salamanders, and they are the ones that really require vernal ponds commonly.
It's those yellow spots in the back is how we can tell those, correct?
That's right, and oftentimes you'll notice they'll be a little lighter, almost like a tannish color, and sometimes almost even white, depending on the area. Another mole salamander is the Jefferson salamander, and it also requires vernal ponds for part of its life cycle. Jefferson salamanders are cool because they blend in really well. They're that darkish gray color, and they have those bluish flecks in their skin, which really makes them look neat. And one of my favorites, this one is very aptly named. This is the marbled salamander. You can see the marbled pattern on its back. And this is another obligate, meaning they must have vernal ponds to complete their life cycle. Here's another obligate salamander. And this one is just gorgeous. This is the blue spotted salamander. And you might notice the caption below that. This one is very rare in Pennsylvania. I think this one is only found in 3 different counties. I think 2 of the counties are in northwestern Pennsylvania and then 1 in north central Pennsylvania. So they have very isolated populations, and you know, we find that it should be imperative that we are preserving their habitat. And so the blue spotted salamander is a state listed species, and so it has very special protection.
I would assume that as a blue spotted salamander, camouflage would be very difficult for this animal.
Yeah, and the thing is that, you know, most salamanders are low profile to begin with, and they do spend a lot of time in the leaf litter and places like that. So they're pretty well hidden most of the time. But yeah, if you would happen to find one, which I never have, I would think that they would stand out really well. Well, it's not just salamanders that require vernal pools. As you might imagine, frogs. Some frogs require vernal pools. And this one, the wood frog, is also a vernal pond obligate. And so therefore it requires a vernal pond to complete its life cycle. The wood frog is a very common frog that you would find in the woods, as the name suggests. And they're quite cool. They have some neat distinctive markings around their eyes, and they have the ridges down their back, and well camouflaged, really neat middle-sized frog, really. And here's the one that I think most people are familiar with, and this is also a vernal pond obligate, meaning requiring vernal ponds for part of its life cycle, and that's the American toad. Most people, or I shouldn't say most, but many people will mistake the toads for a frog. They'll say, oh, I saw a frog, when in fact you probably saw a toad. Toads are very terrestrial, aside from the time where they're spending time in the vernal pond in other stages of life. And toads are pretty ubiquitous across the state. You'll find them in wooded settings, and you'll find them in floodplains along creeks and so on, and sometimes even in your backyard. They tend to get around quite a bit in the adult stage.
Recently, in the last couple of weeks, I've had people mention to me that they've seen like an influx of, some people call them frogs, some people have said toads, coming through their developments, like passing along the streets and heading somewhere. I'm assuming they're heading for a vernal pool.
That's probably true. They could be dispersing. Sometimes you'll notice with certain weather patterns that they will tend to move more. They do like those damp and humid and moist, warm, rainy nights, and you'll find that they'll get around a lot more doing that in search of food or other opportunities.
So there's so many of these animals that live in the ponds. How do they survive when they're in the water?
Well, that's a great question. And so if you understand that they spend part of their lives in the water at some stage of their life, you may ask yourself that question, well, how do they do it? And it's pretty interesting. They use the same adaptation as what fish do. So we all know that fish have gills, and gills are those respiratory organs that organisms have adapted to be able to harvest oxygen from the water. And so what you're seeing here is a marbled salamander larva, meaning the younger stage. It spends that stage in the water, and the way that it is able to breathe is by using those gills on the side of its body.
Looks a little bit like what you would imagine a prehistoric dragon would look like, giant form in an old movie.
Yeah, I agree. They're pretty neat looking, very, very different. And so, of course, you might imagine if they live in the water and they're breathing oxygen in the water through their gills, they have to also eat while they're in the water. And one of the things that many vernal pond obligate animals eat are forms of plankton. This one here is a very large type of organism that could be classified as plankton. This is a fairy shrimp. And the ones that you'll find in Pennsylvania will be roughly a ½ inch or so long. And they do vary in color depending on their diet. Yes, they have a diet as well. And this would be an excellent form of protein for a salamander or a tadpole developing in that vernal pond. So let's go ahead and do a couple more definitions. I know that they're kind of boring for students if you're watching, but sometimes the definitions are the foundation for a lot higher learning. So plankton are small, sometimes microscopic algae and animals that live in the water. And often they form the basis of the food chain. But the food chain in a vernal pond gets its start from something that's quite yucky, decaying matter that's called detritus. And you may imagine that the detritus probably comes from the surrounding environment. What surrounds our vernal ponds? Typically trees. We're talking about forests. We're talking about these bodies of water that develop in these low-lying areas. And so that water will inundate and flood those leaves, and then those leaves begin to break down. And of course, bacteria are doing the decomposition process. Those bacteria in turn serve as food for larger life forms, like protozoans and animal-like protists, which can feed things like fairy shrimp and water fleas and all sorts of little life that you may or may not need a microscope to see. And this interesting one here happens to be very prevalent in vernal ponds throughout Pennsylvania.
So I understand that the frogs and salamanders travel to the ponds. How do the fairy shrimp get in the pond?
Well, that's a great question. They have their life cycle in the water as well. And so they go through the stages of development and then laying eggs, and those eggs will lay dormant. And then once the conditions are correct, they will also hatch.
Very cool.
Okay, let's move on to a really interesting topic. Sometimes, as I mentioned, the salamanders are very hard to find. They're very reclusive. They hide well. They're well camouflaged sometimes. And sometimes the only evidence in a vernal pond that an animal was there is what they leave behind. And these happen to be very conspicuous. And these are called egg masses. And this one here is the spotted salamander egg mass. And it's one of the most commonly spotted egg masses that you'll find in a vernal pond in Pennsylvania. I have a feeling that if you get out there right now and do some hiking in some low-lying areas, you may be able to find some of these right now. And moving on to the next slide, another commonly seen egg mass are wood frog eggs. Wood frog eggs are cool because they have this gelatinous look to them. It almost looks like Jello. They have the dots in the center, and those dots are the developing embryos, which will eventually become tadpoles, which will mature then eventually into the adult wood frog. You can see here that the egg mass was laid around a pine twig, and the water level dropped a little bit, and now they're exposed. And that often happens with wood frog eggs, is you'll see them coming up out of the water like that, which is kind of cool.
Will they still be able to develop, or do they need to be in the water to develop?
They should ideally be in the water. That helps them maintain their moisture and not dry out. Hence the need for the vernal pond condition in the beginning, and them seeking that out. So the ones towards the center may stay, they may stay viable, but the ones on the outside might dry out and not do so well.
Would they possibly become lunch for a different animal?
That's another great point. There are lots of organisms out there that are very opportunistic when it comes to finding a meal. A very savvy raccoon that happens to find that would be pretty happy. Okay, so here's another commonly seen egg mass. This one I happen to photograph myself in a slide I'll show you later. This is an American toad egg mass. And the interesting identifying feature that you'll see with this is that they tend to lay their eggs in like a long strip that tends to spiral. And so you can see the eggs, the individual eggs down through here and the spiraling pattern. And that's very definitive of the American toad. I would probably say if you saw an egg mass just about anywhere in the state, my money would be on this one, that's what you saw. But it could very well be some of the other ones that I just showed. Well, it's not just frogs, it's not just salamanders. There are many other species that use vernal ponds. Species like what is pictured here. This is a wood duck. Wood ducks will spend their time in some of these ephemeral, some people might call it a slough, a floodplain that's temporarily inundated. Other frogs like the pickerel and leopard frog, which I haven't shown, but they're cool. They have spots, hence the name leopard. And then there are other salamanders. The four-toed salamander is an interesting story. It's an obligate like some of the mole salamanders. It's not a mole salamander, but it's defined by the fact that it does have four toes, whereas the other ones have three. So that's an interesting little caveat there.
So
and
with
I just
all,
wanted to show you, I'm sorry, go ahead.
well, question would be, so if all these eggs are hatching within a vernal pool, and depending upon the size, they're kind of competing with each other for food and survival, how does one species typically survive over another? Are wood frogs more hardy, or American toad larvae?
Well, if you take a note of the egg masses that I showed you earlier, if you had to estimate how many individual developing embryos were there, you would certainly say well into the hundreds. And keep in mind, a vernal pond may have dozens and dozens of these egg masses. And so it's a survival strategy to, quote, flood the market with prey. Even though there are predators around, predatory birds and snakes and other critters that may eat them, there's so many prey items that there's protection. And the old saying, there's safety in numbers. And so that's a survival mechanism that's certainly an advantage in that type of situation. There's so much food in a vernal pond that I don't really feel that's a limiting factor. I think the thing that's most remarkable about that situation is the fact that they're relying on that old tried and true evolutionary method of safety in numbers, flooding the market with the prey items, and that's how they stay safe and survive. Competition, yeah, it affects them, but I don't think it's a major factor in the grand scheme of things. Okay, let's move on to vernal ponds, more vernal ponds. I wanted to just show you a few more pictures. So this one is in Tuscarora State Forest. And this one is in Michaud State Forest.
That one kind of looks like a really big lake.
Yeah, and some of them are quite big. They can be quite expansive, but this one during the summer will probably be completely dry. And this one is in Weiser State Forest. This one
Wow.
has a name. It's named Wolf Pond. And I did happen to snap some photos there a few years ago, and that's where I got the eastern toad egg pictures.
That's great. So
You're
these are the
probably
various,
wondering,
these are the various state parks around Pennsylvania?
no, these are the
Oh.
state forest districts. So you heard me mention Tuscarora, which I don't know if you can see my cursor there moving. You heard me mention Weiser State Forest and then Michaud State Forest. So these are the state forest districts, and we have state forest land in those geographic regions. So if we own and manage state forests in the Weiser State Forest District, you can bet that it's going to be within the boundary marked in District 18 Weiser right there.
Okay.
Same can be said for any of the other ones. And a lot of people, when they venture forth throughout the state, they go to a camp or something like that, they remember seeing a sign for a state forest, and this gives you an idea of how they are all related and where they are in relation to one another. And of course, you can learn a lot more about the state forest that we manage at www.dcnr.pa.gov. All you have to do is do a search for DCNR and you'll find it.
That's great. So Ryan, I believe you have a quiz for us that Sherry's going to pull up to poll the listeners to find out what they learned. A few questions.
I'm showing my teacher roots here. I have a little quiz to see who was paying attention.
All right, Ryan,
All
do you
right,
want to go
Ryan.
over these?
Yeah, let's see how everybody did. All right, so number one, what does vernal mean? Multiple choice, winter, spring, or fall? Well, look at that, 41 people got it correct. And that's wonderful that you recognize that that means spring. Moving on to number two, what kind of animals use vernal ponds? Multiple choice, amphibians, plankton, wood ducks, all. Another fantastic result, yes, all. So amphibians, meaning those salamanders and frogs and things like that. Some plankton, which does include animal-like organisms, and wood ducks, so all is the best answer here. Very good job on that one. Number three, what animal is a type of plankton that can be found in vernal ponds? Algae, fairy shrimp, both. This one was a little bit tough, a fairly tough question, because you had to know that algae really aren't animal-like, they're more plant-like. And so the best answer in this particular case is fairy shrimp, okay? That was a toughie. Number four, vernal ponds formed from. This was a slam dunk, look at that. Both was the correct answer there, 37 out of 41 got that one right. And number five, vernal ponds are ponds that usually do not dry up in the summer, meaning they stay wet all year round. That is false. I didn't fool too many people on that one. So I think people paid some great attention to the presentation as shown by the answers here. So nice work, those of you in the crowd who took the time to answer, and thank you for listening. That's great.
Yeah, we need a little cheering sound effect for everybody.
Yeah,
well
the
done.
applause.
That's great. Well, you have some resources to share with us.
I do. So let me see if I can go ahead and advance my slide here. For some reason, it's not doing that. There it is. Okay, so great resource to learn more about vernal ponds. And this happens to be a site that I researched quite a bit when I was drawing up my material for this presentation. This is from the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program, which is actually a part of DCNR. A lot of my colleagues work in the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program, and their job is to find out what kind of organisms live out there in Pennsylvania in the deep, dark forests and some of our aquatic habitats. And they produce some fantastic information. And this website is a great resource to learn more about vernal ponds and many other types of habitat in Pennsylvania as well. And you can see that the website there is www.naturalheritage.state.pa.us, and this particular page called Vernal Pools.
That's great. Well, we are going to check in with some questions from our listeners from the Q&A. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can. So, Ryan, I'm going to start with a question. If you have a vernal pond on your property, what do you need to do to support it or not to harm it?
Well, vernal ponds have evolved as habitats in the state for hundreds of thousands, probably millions of years. And the best thing to do is leave it alone. That, we designate natural areas in state forests to preserve natural habitats and outstanding examples of natural beauty and habitats and things of that nature. And if you see a vernal pool, it obviously probably formed by itself, and the best thing to do would be to leave it alone. Don't mess with it. Don't stir it up. Try not to disturb the eggs. You know, and some of the other things that humans may be guilty of, which would be, of course, cutting the trees down in the area would certainly take away from that detritus that we mentioned earlier on in the presentation, that source of fallen leaves that is the basis of the food chain. And you would want to avoid using any synthetic chemicals in the area, fertilizers and things like that, which could harm the water quality.
Are there state and federal protections or regulations that protect vernal pools?
Well, we have a lot of regulations that protect wetlands, okay? And that doesn't necessarily fall under the umbrella of DCNR. Wetlands are protected lands, but that, like I said, is managed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Basically, on state forests, we always protect our lands, as well as in the Game Commission and other large landowners. So yes, there would be inherent protection as just any natural land would be. But generally speaking, no, there's no designation that I'm aware of, at least, that specifically protects vernal pools. That said, there are protections for the species that inhabit those habitats. So you might have recall I mentioned the blue-spotted salamander, and its habitat is very specially protected because it is a state-listed species.
So one of the questions is, where can we look for vernal ponds, and how can we tell if a pond is seasonal or permanent?
Well, I guess that would just take a period of prolonged observation. But as a general rule, a vernal pond is a pond in a low-lying area, perhaps on the outskirts of where you would find a creek. And you can just tell that over time, as the seasons progress and it gets drier throughout the summer and perhaps the early fall, you would notice that would dry up. And it would take repeat visits. Maybe it's a hiking trail that you visit regularly, or maybe you're somebody who likes to go fishing, and you would notice some of those backwater vernal ponds that would be there in the spring. The next time you go fishing a month or two later, it's dried up. That's probably going to give it away that it's a vernal pond.
So not all spring ponds are vernal ponds.
That's true. Some of our ponds are permanent, and they seem to always have water in them, a period of inundation where you could have more aquatic species persist.
One of our questions is, one of our listeners has 3 vernal ponds on their property, which were created. Will they last for many years? The field where they are is very wet.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the nature of that question. Will you repeat that?
I think the question was that they have 3 vernal ponds on their property, and they're curious whether they will remain for many years, but commenting that it stays very wet.
Well, this year is a little bit of a special year because of how much precipitation we received in the winter with snowfall. We had a little bit of an outlier in terms of all that winter precipitation. I'd say you're just going to have to keep watching and see. Time will tell.
So what would make the difference between finding a big puddle and a vernal pond?
Well, I think the amount of time that the land mass would be covered with water. A vernal pond generally needs to have a certain amount of water in it for a certain amount of time. And the way that I think you would define that biologically would be to see if you can get those vernal pond obligate species to use it. Things like wood frogs and those mole salamanders and so on. That's the true test to find out whether or not it's a vernal pond.
Will some of these amphibians use a stable pond rather than a vernal pond to
Yes,
reproduce?
that's a great question. And sometimes there is overlap, and sometimes it's really about availability. You'll find that those frogs that I mentioned earlier, towards the latter part of the presentation, the pickerel frog and the leopard frog, they're very, very opportunistic when it comes to water. They don't really care a lot of times whether it's a vernal pond or a regular permanent pond. It just so happens to be whatever pond water is available. So that's a great question. Yes, there is some overlap in habitat use in terms of those two types of ponds.
Are we ever going to find a hellbender in a vernal pond?
I would think probably not. Hellbenders require really clean, cold, moving water like you would find in headwater streams in some of our most pristine waters in Pennsylvania. I wouldn't expect to find one there, no.
Everybody's a big fan of hellbenders around here. They're such a interesting looking animal, and the state amphibians, so they are well loved. Couple more questions.
Sure.
Someone heard wood frogs in a vernal pond in March, but then a dry spell dried them up in a week. So how much time is needed for tadpoles to hatch? So I'm guessing their vernal pond dried up. Or will the tadpoles have survived?
No, they won't. They require that submerged aquatic food chain that I mentioned, and that's unfortunate for them that their water source dried up, and that happens, and that's the nature of it. And you have to understand that these organisms, the timing of when they lay those eggs is extremely important. And so those dynamics of spring rains and meltwater and so on, their evolutionary cycle is very much tied into those temporal, seasonal changes. So, in a case like that, maybe that was just bad luck. The frog chose the wrong place to lay the eggs, and the other frog perhaps in the area did not. It might have chosen a better location, and those types of behaviors would be not favored in evolution, because the parents that select the best site for egg laying would have the most successful offspring.
And then I guess fortunately or unfortunately, those eggs may have become a meal for another animal within the food chain.
That's very possible, or they could have just rotted and become food for bacteria.
There you go. Well, thank you everyone for your questions. If we did not get to answer your question, we will contact you with an answer by email. And I want to thank Ryan Reed for joining us for this conversation today. I look forward to exploring the woods nearby to look for a vernal pond. But if you can remind us before we go, if we're out exploring, what should we do or not do if we find a pond?
Well, thank you, Beth. It was my pleasure to join you today. And I'd like to encourage everyone to go out and explore our forests. And maybe you'll even find some of these little critters that we've shown in some of these ponds. But I do want to encourage you that if you do that, to please not disturb those egg masses or those salamanders or frogs. They're just trying to live out their life there. Take a moment to appreciate them visually and let them go on about their lives, and they'll provide more material for us next time.
If you want to explore more about this topic, visit our website for an Explore video about vernal pools, or visit the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program site, or DCNR, for more information about these unique habitats. The links will be in the chat box. And then next time, we have coming up a colleague of yours, I believe, Ryan.
That's correct. Betsy.
We have in May, we have a conversation with botanist Andrew Rohrbaugh from DCNR, Bureau of Forestry, and we'll discuss the value of planting native Pennsylvania plants and flowers to beautify and improve our landscape. And then following that, we have several programs coming up for Learn at Lunchtime. So you can visit our webpage at statemuseum.pa, or I do this every time, statemuseumpa.org to sign up for April Adventures in Nature Lab and other upcoming Learn at Lunchtime programs. We want to thank everybody for attending today. We appreciate that. And we hope to see you next time. Have a great day, everybody. Goodbye.